Morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. I want to remind you that after this talk at 10 o'clock and during the chapel hour, Christian Smith will be giving his second plenary lecture, and I encourage you to go. We had about 140 people last night at his talk, and I think it went really well. I'm Dr. Baker, this is Dr. Bilbro, and we're going to talk about Wendell University. You can read, right? In Education for Health. This is a talk that comes out of, and is in some ways a description of, a book project we are working on together that we have to have a draft by September. And so we're frantically working on that to get that off to the publisher and get the long process of everything that happens after that. So you're going to hear some of what we have to say with this. And I want to say, I know we look young, but we've done a lot in our lifetime, and I'm trying to build some ethos here. So this was on a journey we took long ago. I talked about tripping, but whatever. It's before we worked here. So, I don't know anything about that. And, you know, we care about the earth, and we care about the people, and we cleaned up on some occasions, and again, just building our ethos so you can trust us. That's definitely not Photoshop. Jeff and I are going to be going back and forth in our meeting here, so bear with us. And we're going to leave some time at the end for questions.
Yeah, so I just want to introduce our project real quick, and as Jack said, we'll keep passing the baton with the microphone. Basically, the core of our book project is the idea that America is suffering from this plague of placelessness, and that has infected education system also. So we have an education system designed for placeless people because we're a culture of placeless people. And as we talk, we'll try to unpack more what we mean about place. It's not just geographical, it's these other dimensions also. So Wendell talks about this in terms of upward and lateral mobility. He says that, that the American education system caters to our desires, our consumers' desires for upward mobility, and yet that inevitably results in lateral and downward mobility also. So as he's been arguing for decades, an education founded upon this sort of reductive economic exchange of tuition dollars for the ability to rise in upward mobility should not expect to form healthy, virtuous community members. Right? That's not its goal. But at the ecological and human costs of our hollowed out rural communities and our destructive agricultural practices mount, the need for graduates who have been educated for, as he puts it, responsible membership in a family, a community, or a polity, this need is ever more pressing. So we want to reflect with you a little bit today about how we might prepare students for this sort of responsible membership in place, and how we look very might inspire that.
In Education for Health would begin by forming the imaginations and affections of students, so that rather than desiring upward mobility, they could begin to imagine healthy, placed lives. Over the last few years, we've been teaching Wendell Berry's Hannah Coulter, a novel, in various courses. Told from the perspective of an elderly woman, looking back at her long life with its many joys and travails, the narrative leads readers through the arc of Hannah's emotions as she gradually learns to be content, a virtue which is particularly difficult for those of us in higher education to practice. And what do we mean by that? Well, universities often exist to prepare students to lead better lives in better places. And this obsession with something better erodes our ability to be content. In the opening pages of the novel, Hannah, who is narrating her memories for Andy Catlett, one of the last of their Fort William membership, says that, quote, "This is the story of my life, that while I lived it weighed upon me and pressed against me, and filled all my senses to overflowing, and now is like a dream dreamed. This is my giving of thanks." As the narrative unfolds, the reader begins to understand the deep wisdom of Hannah's proclamation that this story is her giving of thanks. She has been twice widowed, her children have left her, and many of her close friends have died, and yet, in spite of these sorrows, Hannah does not desire a better life. She is grateful for the life that she has lived. One particular narrative thread of the novel speaks to us as educators because it concerns one of the greatest challenges facing higher education today. Its struggle to imagine and serve the health of its place. Maybe you've not thought of that as being the problem. This thread is woven into Hannah's story as she cultivates love for her people and place, even as they are significantly altered, often negatively, by the academy. In this way, the university and its way of life come to be one of her great sorrows. Her sorrow has its origin in the destructive ideology of the university as part of an industrial economy. An economy that brings in customers and sends out displaced individuals with immense debts, you know what that means, having taught those individuals that the good life is anywhere but home. After all of their children have left home to pursue better knowledge in better places, Hannah reflects on the danger of such a vision for life and the salutary example of her husband Nathan, saying, "Most people now are hoping for a better place, which means that a lot of them will end up in a worse one." I think this is what Nathan learned from his time in the army and war. He saw a lot of places and he came home. I think he gave up the idea that there was a better place somewhere else. This is Hannah still speaking. There is no better place than this, not in this world. And it is by the place we've got and our love for it and our keeping of it that this world is joined to heaven. So at the heart of our project is a desire to confront the contemporary academic ideology that claims the university should prepare you all and faculty alike for a better place than their home. In contrast, our hope is that the university might form us to love and keep our place, and so participate in joining our places to heaven. It's significant that when seeking to understand why her children all felt the desire to leave home for a better life elsewhere, Hannah begins to question whether or not she and Nathan told the right stories. Tell better stories. One night, after their children had moved away and the prospect of any of them returning was becoming unlikely, Hannah begins actually mourning over them to Nathan, and she concludes that she had somehow failed her beloved children. And she says, "I just wanted them to have a better chance than I had." Parents, maybe you've heard your parents say that. "I just wanted them to have a better chance than I had." And Nathan, a wise man of few words, who is hurt by her insinuation, responds to Hannah, "Don't complain about the chance you had." Struck by Nathan's response, Hannah finally comes to the sense of the dreadful thing she has said without knowing it. The stories we tell about the chances we have will shape the lives of those people we love. Hannah then recounts her life, the loss of her mother and the arrival of her cruel stepmother, the loss of her young husband Virgil in the war as she's pregnant with their child Margaret, her marriage to Nathan and the birth of her sons Matthew and Caleb, and she concludes that, quote, "The chance you had is the life you've got. You mustn't want to be somebody else. What you must do is this. Rejoice evermore, pray without ceasing. In everything give thanks. I'm not all the way capable of so much, but those are the right instructions." So do our students learn the goodness of rejoicing evermore, the wisdom of ordering their lives toward prayer and service, the truth of giving thanks in all things? What stories are we telling our students as they spend several years in the prime of their youth in these communities at Spring Arbor University? Are the stories we are telling speaking to our students about health, contentedness, the goodness of human limits, of love? Perhaps we ought to be asking ourselves the same question that preoccupies Hannah in this passage. But did we tell the right stories? She says. It was lovely, the telling and the listening, usually the last thing before bedtime. But did we tell the stories in such a way as to suggest that we had needed a better chance or a better life or a better place than we had. Though Hannah's uncertain if they told the right stories, she is certain that telling the right stories is not only possible, but necessary. These stories are threads woven into the garment of our lives, and if we always imply to our students that the life from which they've come is one to which they should never return, aren't we tugging at the loose thread that unravels the whole garment? And how are you ever to know where the thread breaks and where the tug begins? Hannah's musings on the central importance of the narratives we tell lead us to begin this book by asking difficult questions about American universities. And obviously we're thinking a lot about our own university here. How might education lead students to practice healthy contentment with people and places? What are appropriate ends for university education? In what ways could universities shape us into affectionate, virtuous members of our places? So it's our hope that this project will continue a conversation about the purpose of higher education by refocusing our vision on the important connections between the stories we tell and embody, the language we embrace, the work we accomplish together, and the virtues we cultivate in our communities.
So one of the implications of what we're saying, maybe one of the assumption we're saying, is an anthropology, which is probably a word you're going to hear a lot today, but an anthropology just means a theory of the human person, right? So part of our effort here is going to entail helping students see how the stories we tell shape our imaginations and affections, and thus profoundly affect and alter our places. So our own understanding that we're developing here of the power of stories has been clarified recently by this work of Jamie Smith, who was our focus speaker last year, actually. In the first volume of this sort of three-part series, Desiring Kingdom, he gives this anthropology, so quote from Smith. He outlines an anthropology that emphasizes the primacy of love and the priority of the imagination in shaping our identity and governing our orientation to the world. Okay, so it's an anthropology rooted in the human person as a lover, and his stories shape our what we love and how we love. So based on this, Smith argues, quote, education is primarily about the formation or the aiming of our love and desire, and that such formation happens through embodied communal rituals we might call liturgies. These are pedagogies of desire. So one of the goals in our project is to describe a way for the university to be a place that offers our world an alternative anthropology by which students, faculty, and administrators orient their imaginations in such a way that our interactions with people and places are shaped by love. And as part of that, we're particularly concerned with how narrative orients our imaginations to our action, which Smith talks about particularly in this book, Imagining Kingdom. In this book, Smith explores the ways in which our cultural liturgies shape actions. For Smith, humans are kinesthetic and poetic beings. We act and we create. And these actions and creations cannot be separated from each other and sort of conceived as independent realities. They're integrally related. So we should understand the mutually fulfilling role that both actions and creations play in the formation of one another. So the stories we tell shape our actions, and our actions shape the stories we tell. So we're trying to unpack. So our reliance on Barry's fiction and poetry, as we've already demonstrated, starting off with one of Barry's novels, we're going to end with a poem. The reason we do this is because we agree with Smith that stories are integral to re-envisioning what universities are for. As he puts it, the way to the heart is through the body, and the way to the body is through story. So if we hope to reorient our hearts and minds to the transformative work of reshaping universities, we have to begin by telling the right stories. And to do so, we have to re-narrate much of higher education.
We promise it's not just because we're literature professors. Currently, many of our universities tell stories about the need for upward and lateral mobility. I've already established that come from the broader culture's stories about progress and success. So a recent-ish story in the satirical newspaper, The Onion, don't be like one of those politicians who thinks it's real and then retweets one of the horrible stories, captures this dominant belief that mobility is an indicator of success. Titled, "Unambitious Loser with Happy Fulfilling Life Still Lives in Hometown." The article recounts a sad story. Longtime acquaintances confirmed to reporters this week that local man Michael Husmer, an unambitious 29-year-old loser who leads an enjoyable and fulfilling life, still lives in his hometown and has no desire to leave. As a reporter talks with Husmer's more successful high school classmates, the dreary life he leads comes into focus. Former high school classmates confirm that Husmer has seemingly few aspirations in life, citing occasional depressing run-ins with the personally content townie during visits back home, as well as embarrassing Facebook photos in which the smiling dud appears alongside family members whom he sees regularly and appreciates and enjoys close, long-lasting relationships with. Additionally, pointing to the intimate, enduring connections he's developed with his wife, parents, siblings, and neighbors, sources reported that Husmer's life is pretty humiliating on multiple levels. In particular, those familiar with the pitiful man, who is able to afford a comfortable lifestyle without going into debt, confirm that he resides just 2 blocks from the home he grew up in, miles away from anything worthwhile, like high-priced bars and clubs. In fact, sources stated that the pathetic loafer has never had any interest in moving to even a nearby major city, despite the fact that he has nothing better to do than, quote, sit around all day, unquote, being an involved member of his community and using his ample free time to follow pursuits that give him genuine pleasure. Right. Our laughter at this portrayal of a loser reveals our awareness that we do associate leaving home with having made it. Even though the stress and anxiety of Husmer's successful acquaintances calls into question the desirability of such a mobile life. Barry's been describing this cultural obsession with restless mobility for decades now, arguing that it causes extensive damage to our land and our character. As he explains, quote, upward mobility as we now are seeing implies downward mobility, just as it has always implied lateral mobility. It implies, in fact, social instability, ecological oblivion, and economic insecurity, unquote. Elsewhere, Barry uses the term boomers to describe those who are always on the lookout for better career opportunities in better places. Barry derives this term and its opposite, sticker, from Wallace Stegner's description of the 2 contrasting types of pioneers who settled the West. Stegner, a 20th century author who writes about the Western landscape in which he was raised, identifies boomers as those who came to the West looking to get rich. They were willing to damage the land and its existing communities for a quick profit. Once they had extracted all they could easily get from a place, whether a mine, a forest, or a farm, they moved on to a more abundant place. But as Barry explains, quote, not all who come to American places come to plunder and run. Some come to stay, or came with the hope of staying. These Stegner called stickers or nesters, and these terms are an important distinction here. These stickers came west looking to transplant themselves into a new home. In another essay, Barry describes such people as nurturers, those whose goal is health. The health of the land, health of the community, and the health of the country.
So I don't know if you guys have read anything by Brachiology. You've read one book, I think you read them all, but they are basically all typical boomer stories. These are 19th century poor boys who leave the poor countryside and come up with, get a rich benefactor and soon are successful, wealthy businessmen. These were outrageously popular in the 19th century. These sort of are the typical American dream story. So what we want to clarify, though, as Jack just laid out this distinction between boomers and stickers, what we want to clarify is the root difference between boomers and stickers, between people like Horatio Alger Jr. heroes and Wendell Berry heroes, is not simply that one group is mobile and one group is stationary. It's too simplistic. Rather, these groups are defined by their contrasting narratives, motivations, and affections. Berry explains this in his recent Jefferson lecture, It All Turns on Affection. Quote, the boomer is motivated by greed, the desire for money, property, and therefore power. And the title of Berry's lecture, It All Turns on Affection, indicates that his emphasis in this distinction is one on affection. And this clarifies a common misguided criticism of Berry's hobby. Berry does not say that everybody who leaves home is somehow this greedy, selfish, evil boomer. Rather, he emphasizes that our affections always have consequences. Thus, the individual motivated by greed, the desire for money, property, and therefore power is not necessarily the individual who moves to the only state where she can find gainful employment, leaving loved ones half a nation away. Nor is the boomer the individual who leaves the small town where his entire family lives because his suffering used their hands. Right? There are certainly instances where it's appropriate to move. Instead, the boomer is the individual who is guided by wrong affections. Affections for power, for wealth at whatever cost, for personal success. So boomer, most precisely, names a story, a way of imagining success that leads to a way of living characterized by disinterest in place, limits, and externalized consequences. So perhaps an important distinction is that a sticker may be forced to leave a place but will nest in a new place. A boomer wants to leave a place and is willing to leave again should a better opportunity arise elsewhere. So because our affections have such far-reaching consequences, shaping the questions we ask and the ways we arrange knowledge, both Stegner and Berry focus on the conflicting internal desires named by boomer and sticker. Desires we should work to rightly order, in a sort of Augustinian sense, and perhaps also in a way that harmonizes with what Christian Smith was talking about last night. So Berry warns against seeing these terms as categories of people, arguing instead that they differentiate between conflicting internal motivations. As Berry writes, all of us, I think, are in some manner torn between caring and not caring, staying and going. So the choice to root ourselves and shape our desires to the limits of our place is never a clear-cut, one-time choice. Rather, it's a long process. It's a narrative of refining and ordering our affections, of choosing to serve the health of our place, rather than to fulfill our individual desires, and of seeking the kind of knowledge, this is where education comes in, that will enable us to do this sort of work. As Berry explains about this choice, having chosen one way, one is never free of the opposite way. We must keep on choosing.
Hey, where's this?
Far away.
Far, far away. It is far. It feels far away. Additional snow, Michigan. I grew up in Michigan, and I think if I hadn't grown up in Michigan, it would be very hard for me to want to continue to stay here the winters here. I've got to be a sticker. I'm staying. So currently, boomerism pervades our educational culture to such an extent that nearly all departments in nearly all universities are infected by it. I know that sounds like we're generalizing. Maybe we are. As Wes Jackson claims, upward mobility is now the only major that universities offer. He says, little attention is paid to educating the young to return home or to go some other place and dig in. There is no such thing as a homecoming major. Stephen Baumel-Prediger and Brian Walsh extend Jackson's argument in their essay, Education for Homelessness or Homemaking, the Christian College in a Postmodern Culture, claiming that, quote, colleges and universities, small or large, public or private, Christian or secular, tend to educate for upward mobility, to alienate people from their local habitation, and to encourage the vandalization of the earth. What such an education forgets, we would say, is the need for a vocation that subsumes these techniques under a higher purpose, the restoration of health and the flourishing of one's community. As Berry trenchantly observes in Higher Education Home Defense, education, in the true sense, of course, is an enablement to serve both the living human community in its natural household or neighborhood and the precious cultural possessions that the living community inherits or should inherit. To educate is literally to bring up, to bring young people to a responsible maturity, to help them be good caretakers of what they have been given, to help them to be charitable toward fellow creatures. And if this education is to be used well, it is obvious that it must be used somewhere. It must be used where one lives, where one intends to continue to live. It must be brought home. Graduates can't serve their communities. They can't take care of them if they don't settle somewhere and bring their education home.
Hopefully this is not like your education. That's the idea. Because this is the sort of education that we're arguing fails to form students to come home, right? It's this sort of cookie-cutter industrial model of education. Alternatively, an education for health, one that forms students to serve their homes, is going to have to begin by reforming the students' imaginations so that they ask better questions. As Berry explains, differently oriented affections lead boomers and stickers to ask different kinds of questions and to operate in different economies. The boomer or the exploiter, quote, asks of a piece of land only how much and how quickly it can be made to produce. The nurturer or sticker asks a question that is much more complex and difficult. What is its carrying capacity? That is, how much can be taken from it without diminishing it? We expands on this contrast in a recent interview with Bill Moyers. In that interview, he said this: the answers will not come from walking up to your farm and saying, this is what I want and this is what I expect from you. Rather, you walk up and you say, what do you need? And I think it's obvious you can't really walk up to the students in this picture or to the chickens in this industrial farm and say, what do you need? Or you don't even know them on an individual level. You just have to give them what you think they want and really what you want based upon what you want to get out of them. Right? It's an industrial model. So these different questions, what do you want versus what do I want versus what do you need? These different questions stem from differently oriented desires. One desires quick profit and the other desires health. And they also result in different complexities of accounting. One values only profit and externalizes all other costs and damages. The other seeks to give a more adequate accounting for all things. Health is a very complex standard. These distinctions mark the contrast Barry draws in his essay, The Two Economies, between our industrial economy, which tends to destroy but does not comprehend or account for, and the great economy, or the kingdom of God, which includes everything in its comprehensive pattern or order, even the fall of sparrow, Christ says. Right? So the fundamental difference between teaching students to get what they want from their places and teaching them to ask what you need marks not only the difference between boomers and stickers, but also the difference between a more medieval way of organizing knowledge. If you imagine knowledge as a tree with interconnected, everything connects together and is ordered. And the organization or lack thereof in modern universities, where you have separate departments that don't really talk to each other very much. Although Focus is a great example of us trying to combat that. Asking what do I want simply leads to education and techniques of extraction for personal appetite. But the question, what do you need, leads to education oriented for charity and health. C.S. Lewis describes this difference in terms of the contrast between medieval learning and the mere technical training increasingly offered today. And in some ways, I think this quote gets at the heart of what we're arguing. So pay attention to the distinction which makes here. He says, for the wise men of old, the cardinal problem had been how to conform the soul to reality. And the solution had been knowledge, self-discipline, and virtue. So education is to train your soul to fit reality, and you do so via knowledge, self-discipline, and virtue. However, for modern applied science, and for the modern university, he says this: the problem is how to subdue reality to the wishes of men, and the solution is a technique. Right? So the university is going to train you in techniques to get what you want. To get more money, to get more resources, to get more pleasure, whatever it is you want. The work of conforming our souls to reality via knowledge, self-discipline, and virtue is long and arduous. But if we desire to be responsible members of our places, this is the work we will have to take up. The contrast between boomers and stickers, the different desires they have, the different stories they tell, the different questions they ask, the different economies they participate in, the contrasting models of the university they propose, should hopefully by now be clear. The boomer wants to isolate knowledge from its origins in order to maximize utility and profitability, but the sticker values this more rooted, interconnected kind of learning whose branches connect as much as possible. So the way we organize and order knowledge stems from the kinds of questions we ask, which in turn rise from the orientations of our desires. So now hopefully you can see how the anthropological claim we started with, that humans are loving beings, has its implications in different types of educational systems.
You would not believe how hard it is to just find a picture of our campus online. This is what we found. Anyone know what that is with the fixie? Skinny jeans and a fixie? Anyone? No? Okay. I don't know how old this picture is. But we're at SAU. Right? I think that's where I'm at right now. I'm not having a stroke. We're at SAU. Right? This is a place we are at. You might not realize it. You might think the university is the only thing in this town, but it's not. There are people who are unconnected with this university and who live here. And so we are situated in a place, and that matters to us. And so we sort of, in working through our project, have been thinking about this place especially. This isn't abstraction for us. This is actually a very practical project of how will this shape the way we think about education at this university. So rooted education then should begin by teaching students how to trace the interconnections of wisdom and health through an emphasis on language and imagination. And in this way, it might begin to form the affections and stories of students so that they desire the health of their place. It's our hope. While boomers tend to allow their desires to form their questions, Barry argues that a mature, nurturing person will shape their desires and questions to the limits of their place. He says, we have, in fact, no right to ask the world to conform to our desires. Sooner or later, if we hope to grow up, we have to confront the opposite imperative, that our rights and the realization of our desires are limited by human nature, by human community, and by the nature of the places in which we live. In other words, you are not a free-floating radical. You don't get to live independently of the world, independently of a place, and independently of people. And if you believe you do, you are only fooling yourself. Teaching our students to be stickers, to be nurturers, thus involves teaching them to patiently and faithfully ask their neighbors and places, what do you need? Therefore, our goal in this project is to encourage and challenge students of all ages to cultivate the disciplines and virtues that will enable them to love their homes and all that that entails. Our argument may encourage anyone who wants to dwell more fully in place, but our focus will be on how universities might contribute to this kind of placed education. Within universities, we are particularly talking to students and teachers in the hopes that they might begin to do the hard work of integration themselves, sort of at the ground level. Of course, we'd be delighted if university administrators read along and considered institutional changes that could further these goals. But we're not going to propose any big solutions that would have to be imposed from the top by institutional fiat. In fact, looking for such a big solution would only exemplify the diseased belief that change comes from the top, that power is centralized. So our solutions are quite intentionally not big. Students will be educated for homemaking, not when leaders establish some ideal college, but when we all participate in a tradition and culture that values places and inspires its members to participate actively in their various communities, to tell the right stories, to order their affections, to ask the right questions, and to do good work where they are. Hence the garden, as one example. Indeed, Barry's hopes are similar, but while Barry ends up turning away from universities because he considers these institutions to be hopelessly committed to false ends, we have more hope that some universities might be able to contribute to healthy communities. So this is the point where we sort of critique Barry, and we did this in the fall, and when Barry was in the audience, and it was a little terrifying. And I don't know, I said it in class, I shouldn't say here when I'm being recorded, what he said back to me, oh, heck no, except he said something else, and it's really great. When I said, you're not angry at us, please. So he's not angry. But he does not have a lot of hope for higher education. In his essay, The Work of Local Culture, he considers and then rejects the idea that universities can provide the healing learning we need. May we look, he says, for universities to help. Or may we look for help to the universities. Well, the universities are more and more the servants of governments and corporations. So he concludes, quote, that one resurrected rural community would be more convincing and more encouraging than all the government and university programs of the last 50 years. And I think that it could be the beginning of the renewal of our country. So, okay, while we agree that healthy rural communities are incredibly important, in fact, both of us trace our desires to be homemakers to years we spent in such communities in our youth. We are now faculty members in a university situated, interestingly, in a rural community. Indeed, our local community includes this small university where we work and many young people from rural communities. Maybe some of you attend here. Furthermore, most people today don't live in rural communities, so it's increasingly imperative that we consider how urban and suburban places can be more responsibly tied to their sources of agriculture. Thus, we believe that universities, while not being the whole solution, we're not trying to solve everything here. This isn't a panacea. They're not going to be the whole solution. They can at least begin to form their members into more rooted, healthy inhabitants of their communities. In other words, our contention is that in spite of Barry's dim hopes for universities, his vision can nevertheless guide higher education toward health. So we take him at his word when he writes in an essay that, Quote, an essayist not only has no right to expect complete agreement, but has a certain responsibility to ward it off. If you tell me, dear reader, that you agree with me completely, then I must suspect one or both of us of dishonesty. So, while we certainly don't dismiss Barry's valid critique of the university, we do think that we can look for help from universities. Universities can shape citizens who care about their places and the people who inhabit them. And perhaps ironically, we think Barry's essays, fiction, and poetry can guide universities in this endeavor.
So, sort of to wrap it up this morning, what we want to do is just give you, in the next 5 minutes or so, give you a brief overview of the rest of our project. Okay, so now this is going to be admittedly broad, but at least you'll see kind of the way we see this working out. So in the first chapter of our book, we share a brief narrative regarding how many universities arrived in their current disoriented and fragmented state, sort of history of the university. Such universities no longer know what they're educating students for, what they're leading them toward. In fact, some critics call it a multiversity, and it's a sort of blah, where there's no unifying principle. Yet, as we've already mentioned, the most fundamental question is what students are for, or what people are for, perhaps, as the title of the book is derived from a book that Barry actually asks. Because education always implies an anthropology, an account of what people are for. So Barry's body of work extends a tradition that teaches us to imagine that our human purpose, our fundamental human purpose, is to be properly placed, to learn where we are. That might sound ridiculous, but let me unpack what this means. Barry traces this tradition through the Bible, Homer, Augustine, Dante, and Eliot, and he sums it up by saying that a full understanding of place leads to the axiom that, quote, to be in place is good, and to be out of place is evil. Barry justifies the start claim in the remainder of his sentence. He goes on to say this, for where we are with respect to our place, both in the order of things and on earth, is the definition of our whereabouts with respect to God and our fellow creatures. Barry's phrase, in the order of things and on earth, indicates that his understanding of place includes a geographic dimension, includes a sort of location, where are we? But it also includes dimensions of hierarchy, so in relation to God, of community, in relation to the people, and of tradition, in relation to our time. So throughout the rest of our project, we explore how a university might educate students to be properly oriented in each of these four directions. Okay? And we think that there's some commonalities in all of them. For instance, to accomplish this task, we first want to think about how imagination, language, and work are the three interdependent means by which we come to care for our places and by which we orient ourselves in each of these four dimensions. So currently, universities fail to foster place knowledge because of their disorientation and fragmentation. So following Barry, we suggest that universities would do well to return to the medieval vision of knowledge as a rooted tree. This metaphor reminds us to pay attention to the ways that knowledge coheres, a particularly important reminder in our highly specialized and fragmented age. Thus, the first step toward a healthier university is to reimagine the organization of knowledge. The two central means by which we then work our understanding of this imagined coherence are through responsible common language and through physical work. So we think that knowledge is tied together through speaking an accurate language and then through working together. Jargon, specialized language that allows speakers to hide the consequences of their words, is one of the chief symptoms and perpetuators of our cultural fragmentation. So in order to come to know our place, we need to cultivate a better language, one that allows us to make sense together. Nevertheless, our language remains abstracted from our place, and so always falls short of its complex realities. And the chief way that our language is sharpened and made more accurate is through work. This is why there's such an emphasis on internships, on service learning, on actually applying our knowledge throughout education, right? Through getting our hands dirty and confronting the gritty nuances of our situation, we allow this work to refine and sharpen our language. So what we do in the first half of our project is to lay out this three-part approach to educating students for homemaking. First, share stories of habitation and dwelling to form healthy imaginations, tell the right stories. Second, study trivia and read literature for what we can learn from it and speak a common responsible language. And then finally, to do work that enacts our love so that we actually participate in local healing economies. For imagination, language, and work to flourish in students' lives, though, they'll also need to be shaped by virtues or habits that actually inform us for responsible membership in a family, a community, or a quality.
So in the second part of the book, then, in the project, we're sort of thinking of this as dimensions of place. We're going to look at 4 key dimensions in which humans ought to learn to be placed: hierarchy, geography, community, and tradition, as Jeff just mentioned. In a recent conversation at Yale, Barry was asked about the problems with higher education. He responded that the intellectual structure that's represented by universities is probably wrong, awry somehow. It would be interesting to just raise the question like this: where are we? He goes on to note that asking this question would disrupt the current departmental structure of universities, as this basic question of place can't be answered within the walls of any one department. That's one of the reasons, in theory, the university has a gen ed program, is because the education, the shared education you all have will be in the general education program, not only in your major. In focusing on these 4 dimensions of place, then, we seek to provide an alternative structure by which we might pursue this question of our location. So we're certainly not proposing these 4 dimensions as an alternative organization for universities. Our argument instead is that the departmental boundaries need to be more porous, and that all of us need to ask this fundamental question in our work. Yes, we're both literature professors, but we don't believe this is just for us. Ultimately, these 4 dimensions can't really be separated. Indeed, understanding these 4 aspects of place as dimensions serves to remind us that they all intersect and interrelate. One can't be rightly placed in community if one is displaced hierarchically, or geographically, or chronologically. Looking at them in turn, however, will hopefully allow us to understand the importance of each, and then to imagine how we can cultivate our proper place in each. So as we examine these 4 dimensions, we're also going to suggest 4 virtues that students ought to cultivate in order to properly work toward the health and flourishing of their place. If you were at Christian Smith's talk last night, that the idea of eudaimonia, of flourishing, of happiness, of health. The theological and cardinal virtues are certainly vital, but in our deracinated culture, we're especially in need of virtues that will reorient and plant us. We're not throwing away the cardinal virtues, but we need to recast 2 of these traditional virtues, fidelity and affection, and then offer 2 additional virtues, gratitude and memory, as arts that are of particular importance to students today. So maybe you can think of that, how that might be. So it's our hope that practicing the virtues of fidelity, affection, gratitude, and memory will aid students who desire to be rooted homemakers, people who are placed. So we're going to conclude now, as we're going to conclude every chapter in the book, as we have. So this talk sort of mirrors that methodology. We're going to end by reading one of Barry's poems. By framing our argument with stories and poems, we hope that this book will not only persuade readers rationally, but will also convince them on the level of their imaginations and affections. We tell these stories of place and contentment and gratitude in order to offer an alternative to the prevailing stories of upward and lateral mobility. And in this Sabbath poem, Barry speaks for the land, inviting us all to come and learn from our places, to come and treat them well. The need comes on me now to speak across the years, to those who finally will live here after the present ruin, in the absence of most of my kind, who by now are dead, or have given their minds to machines and become strange, overqualified for the hard handwork that must be done, to remake, so far as humans can remake, all that humans have unmade. To you, whoever you may be, I say, come, meaning to stay. Come, willing to learn what this place, like no other, will ask of you and your children, if you mean to stay. This land responds to good treatment, I heard my father say time and again in his passion to renew, to make whole what ill use had broken. And so to you, whose lives taken from the life of this place I cannot foretell, I say, come and treat it well. Thank you.
We got time for questions.
Yeah, everybody needs to be there by 10. Yeah. Yeah, maybe.
So we've got about 10 questions. Any comments or questions about the universities themselves are kind of weird places down here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a interesting question to talk about. The universities are very odd communities. I think one of the ways that universities can be better communities is actually as professors being more communities. It's not too bad at Spring Arbor, but at a lot of universities, professors come for a couple of years trying to get published and move on to a better job, which means teaching less, actually, right? Because teaching is teaching. You get many reasons. So a lot of universities, the professors themselves model this sort of displaced, forward-looking ability. And I think that they train their students to and to model their students just like that. So I think universities are weird communities, and if you go to students who come to where you meet, but one of the problems is when professors teach students to be different.
Yeah, I think that our position is, listen, universities aren't going away. So, right, maybe if we were talking about an ideal world, there'd be a university in everybody's backyard, so you wouldn't have to leave home, you can go to your university. And in some ways, that's the idea of a community college, is that it serves the community, it's funded by the community. But given that most universities are further away from homes, our hope is that we can propose something that will train students in that short time we have them. It's like a workshop, that you leave this workshop, you're prepared to run, you go do this.
And it's also it's also, I think, also sometimes to leave home and get some new insights and get some perspectives and challenges, and then come back and help use that to consider, right? It may not help to spend your whole life in sort of this limited mindset. So we're not saying that cross-cultural study is bad, or getting out and seeing things are bad. But we're saying if that's your whole life, you're always out doing new things, that's
How do you kind of reconcile this idea of returning home when it does feel like the push of most of the universities is to go and make disciples and address the world?
Yeah. Jack, I have one.
I think in part we would just say we feel like that's a wrong-headed goal of Christian university. And that is not to say that missions don't matter, and that is not to say that understanding local communities don't matter. And oftentimes, right, we relate a place that becomes very parochial, and we have very narrow views, and those views are actually wrong views, and they need to be corrected. And sort of that getting out allows that. I think of like crisis ministry, like how far did he travel?
Yeah.
Like he didn't sail to America ever. It wasn't. We just pit local and global against each other. I mean, global has now even become part of the global economy.
And also, I think a lot of new research and teaching on missions have even talked about and sort of exposed the way that a lot of the method of missions has been destructive to local communities elsewhere. So I'm thinking about books like Helping First and other things, thinking about, well, maybe missions model just sending people is not always the best, that we should instead think about how to collaborate with local leaders and how are local people to, because they know they can do better. So often, Westerners come into these places and something's wrong, they don't know what's going on. So I think even in missions can be done with a much more, at least a greater awareness of the importance of local communities.
Yeah, sometimes missionaries are the best bloomers, or best stickers, because they understand that to witness to a culture, you have to be a part of that culture. And so you learn the language, you learn the culture, you understand what you need to do. And I think even embedded in missions is the role.
When we talk about like telling stories and choosing to tell better stories, I'm just wondering, so what are better stories in our narrative again? And if we want to share our narratives, then how can we make that better? Like what's the process of better storytelling?
Yeah, right. Okay, so we teach world literature, and we don't teach just whatever. We teach the best that has come out of the Western tradition. So how do you tell better stories? I think you read better stories. I think you participate in better stories. You don't necessarily be the one who determines what a good story is. You listen to what human culture in the last 2,000 years has said
or 3,000 years of Senate are religious stories. I think that's one place, is submit to the tradition and submit to the history of good religion.
And I'll just make another point. I have some students who've been teasing me recently because I don't see enough Disney movies apparently. But Disney stories in general are horrible because they're all about you can do whatever you want to do. You can fulfill your dreams. Just go out and do like that Frozen song, let it go. Just forget your family, forget your home, you can go be yourself. Of course, Frozen ends up critiquing that. Right? She comes back home and she realizes that song was sort of wrong. But in general, we get the stories we deserve. We get the stories we want. So it's American culture that loves the story. You know, the guy, the self-made man, or the self-made woman who went out and conquered the world and made a name for himself. We get these Disney stories, and I think that's toxic. You know, when children are raised with stories of people who did great things themselves, who benefited a lot, and we don't really think about what they cost their family or their community in place. Well, for those children, they get shaped to want to go eat that. So it's just a progression.
And it's the difference between reading the Odyssey and being like, hey, cool, it's a story about monsters, and this guy can destroy them. Right? That's like a secondary tertiary virtue that Odysseus has, and it's really his wiliness and cleverness that marks him. The primary virtue is eudaimonia. It's returning home and flourishing where he is. That's why that poem is I think, I would argue, is powerful.
Okay, your question?
Yeah. Just kind of give, I definitely, like you said, give placement, but I think it almost is a stark contrast to what reality is. Here it's not like we're just starting to move from being placed at home to being boomers, because I guess my question is, what do you do about people who are already displaced, that families are already displaced? Where do they find their home? Where do they find that place, especially with the job market, which doesn't allow a lot of opportunity within rural communities?
I would say that's what you described is not health. And so sometimes the reality is a harsh reality, but I don't think that precludes our responsibility to actually work toward health. So I wouldn't say that the goal of that person isn't to continually be looking for jobs and have to be moving around. That is stressful because the family wants to be in a place of stability in a job, etc. So I guess I just maybe flip that a little bit and say that the goal should be for being able to remain. The reality might be that's not the case, but the reality should keep us from wanting to work toward that. Does that?
Yeah.
Is that it? Yes. You know someone who has gone 4 years, a person who was sort of top of his career, but because he's in his early 50s, has been 4 years without employment.
I mean, our economy is messed up right now.
What do you say to that? Just stick around, you know, like that you go where the job is.
When I saw the picture of the garden, I was thinking one of the things that kind of helps us to connect, I think, where we're at, is doing something simple like planting a garden, or even if it's not a big garden, even if you're in an apartment and it's something very small. But I think that puts you in sync with the weather and the climate, the things that are happening locally in a way that helps you resist any nationalizing influences that might kind of keep you want to make it free radical. So I really liked when you guys were doing that project, and I think that if I had to suggest something to help people feel rooted where they're at, it could be something that simple, plant a garden.
Yeah. Well, I think it seems so simple and small and sort of irrelevant, but I think you're right that it has these powerful repercussions that it sort of shape us in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think